that you guys can help tell us some of your secrets for how to do this. But I thought maybe we could start with Gianpiero, because I wanted to sort of put this question to you is, why don't we have big tech giants in Europe anymore? Because this was not always the case. About 18, 19 years ago, when I started writing about technology, the big names were Ericsson, Nokia. We had giants, right? And at the moment, you know, all the big European tech companies, or you know, even the big European tech companies just don't match up in size to the US competitors. So what happened? Where did we go wrong?
We have giants. We have Nokia in Finland, we had Olivetti in Italy, Bull in France, Nixdorf in Germany, but there were national champions, not European champions. There were giants, but not an ecosystem. The difference that the Silicon Valley made in the 80s is to create a strong ecosystem coming from decades of story before and transforming what was the single company that acted in a single state, single nation, in a strong ecosystem that dominated the world. We had no ecosystem in Europe, and this was the first point of weakness of Europe.
Do you think we're changing that? Are we creating more of an ecosystem now?
We are on the way, because this commission and the next commission will draw the right situation to create a strong ecosystem in Europe, but depends from companies that must be united, no? And must have the same objective to rise an ecosystem. Depends from the single governments, national governments that can help the national champions to become European, and depends from Europe that must help European champions to become global. If we understand these simple recipes, we will see very nice thing in the future.
It would be great to hear from Oleg and Michal now in terms of, I mean, maybe starting with you, Oleg, but what do you find quite difficult when you're sort of trying to grow as a sort of European challenger? And,
I think that the main barrier or the main challenge is the fact that the European Union is still very fragmented, and instead of having a single market, even we have this policy of digital single market, we still have the barriers, national barriers, and thus we do have 28 national markets. And this means that when you want to expand and to enter a new market, then you need to assess from legal perspective, from tax perspective, like entering and going on a new territory. And this actually creates the barrier for the European companies to expand. Because if we look at the global players, most of them come from huge, large markets, so they had the possibility to become big, and being big in digital is a must. Mm-hmm. So to be able, you know, to have data, to bring value to the customers, and so on. So this was their advantage, coming from big markets, having very low legal framework, which is not the case now in Europe, because we have the European legislation, and after that we have national legislation. So, yeah.
So it feels a little bit like just all the different barriers kind of stop the small to medium-sized companies from kind of achieving that same level of growth. Michal, do you find it? Is this the experience of Seznam as well?
Yeah, I would agree completely. I really think that's the question of fragmentation in Europe, which is really one of the barriers, very important one. We have so many languages in Europe. Many countries pay with euro, some don't. This is something that you don't see in United States, where we look in for the inspiration, and also so many differences in the policy area. I mean, we are doing a great job as Europe, moving forward, creating a digital single market. But we still need to go further, and I think that's part of the EUTA's biggest goal, and I think we're doing a great job being a partner to European politicians, explaining them what needs to be done, where are the gaps in the policy areas to improve. And I think one of the great challenges and issues is also the question of taxation. That's also a question for larger companies in Europe, which tends to grow because they pay completely different taxes compared to the multinational companies. So really a big issue that needs to be solved to help the European companies. And also the question of enforcement of the decisions which are being made in Europe, like the competition cases. The Android case, very important to Seznam, because that's something very damaging us in Europe and in Czech Republic. And I think on one hand, we should be very grateful that Margaret Vestager made the decision as a commissioner to make the decision against Google in the shopping case and in the Android case, for example. But the problem is the enforcement. We have the decision, that's great, but we need to see the enforcement. And this is a great goal for the next commission right now, because there is no way to do it right now by the end of the commission's terms. So we are looking forward to see the enforcement of these decisions in the coming years.
It does feel a little bit like the fines that are levied just don't, they're kind of like pocket change.
And they pay the fines like a tips at the bar, by the way. So there needs to be real change on the market, not just paying a fines, which is somehow 1% or less than 1% of the company's actives. That's something that needs to be much more real change on the market. Really push like the Microsoft was pushed in 2012, where the Commission really mean it. And I think this is something that we should see with Google, for example, as well.
But this issue of regulation, I think, is a really tricky one. And Magda, I wonder whether you can kind of talk about this, because on the one hand, we're sort of saying that there's not enough regulation of some companies, and yet, on the other hand, regulation is also a problem. We're maybe over-regulating companies in Europe. So how do you sort of untangle that one?
Yeah, so I think on the top what has already been flagged. So we have still a number of national markets that are divided. Another challenge that we've been observing, and this is also one of the reasons why the Alliance was founded, was that the debate about technology in Europe and the rules for technology were somehow drafted with the global players in mind. So very often we faced a situation where the standards that were set were actually not the standards for an average SME, not to mention even a scale-up, we perceived ourselves as scale-up, so no longer startups, not necessarily SMEs, but still way to go before going global or even cross-border. So one of the unintended consequences of setting the standards with the global players with big resources in mind is that for smaller players, these standards are very difficult to meet. Not to mention the newcomers that, from day one very often will have to meet a number of rules that will limit their room for innovation. Second point, I think, which we also have been observing is that Michal already flagged that is enforcement, but he mentioned he thought about enforcement of the specific decisions. And what we're saying is, are we sure that the rules that we set for European players are actually followed by all the players that are actually in Europe? Because if not, then the rules that we're putting on privacy, on values, and on a number of issues that are very close to European hearts would put us at competitive disadvantage versus some other players which don't have to follow them. So I think, of course, this is one of the elements of the entire picture, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, it sort of seems like we're maybe shooting ourselves in the foot twice on this, because on the one hand we make really hard rules to follow, which are sort of strangling smaller companies, and then the big ones that can disregard them anyway. The other interesting thing that a couple of you were telling me about was that it's actually not just the sort of the really top line competition law that makes that we read about in the newspapers because it makes good headlines, but it's sort of really small things are still making a kind of slightly unlevel playing field in Europe, like the postal rules, for example, which, Oleg, it makes it difficult to send parcels from one part of Europe to the other. It's more expensive than having something shipped, from China.
Yeah, as you know, the postal rules were established 50, 60 years ago, and they were established for a reality of those times. And nowadays, UPU system is used in a different direction. And a part of this, because as you said, there are small elements that actually damage or can damage. And a part of that, we have the VAT system that is sometimes is built in a way that the products are declared as being gifts. A part of that, we have the customs duties and so on. So yeah, we need to assess this matter as well. But everything that we discuss here leads actually to creating a level playing field for all the players, global players, local players, and so on. But at the same time, we need to be balanced in legislation, because and we need to be also very clear and transparent on how the things can be solved. Because I think that we do not need to build legislation against someone or against a group of companies, but we need to build legislation for a purpose, so in order to improve the situation.
And I get the sense that the digital single market, although most people applaud that as an initiative, it just doesn't feel like it's quite delivered what it, what people wanted it to. Is that a kind of fair assessment amongst companies that you speak to?
I'd say that in most of cases we agree with the diagnosis. So tax system, international tax system has to be revised, right? Privacy have to be protected. Then the question is to what extent we're actually we understand the technology that we're regulating, right? Because even if you look at the GDPR, works on GDPR was around 4 years, if I remember correctly. Then it took 2 years to implement. The way that data processing looked like 6 years before, it changed drastically. So the big question for us was, are decision makers well informed about the, how technology works? This is one of the reasons also why European Tech Alliance, we decided to put our effort and experience of scaling up and of using technology to be at the disposal of those who would like to learn more.
So you're hoping to educate the Commission maybe a little bit.
To exchange.
We're going to run out of time, so I'm just wondering to sort of gather our thoughts. I mean, if I could ask each of you, what would be one sort of change or recommendation or policy that you'd like to see brought in to kind of make it easier to really scale up companies in Europe? And if I start from Michal and work backwards.
I would probably say maybe no more policies in certain areas. I think in certain point in time we've probably switched from creating policies that would support European companies to a fight against Google, Facebook, Amazon and others, which is not exactly the same thing. So I think we should rather focus on, helping Europe rather than defending Europe, because that's always better. Not defending, that's not really a working strategy in long term. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the enforcement that we've been speaking in the group. Enforcement of what we have. It doesn't have to be only the competition, as I was saying before. It's also in the policy level in general. So all the players all around Europe, no matter if they are based in Europe or if they are outside of Europe, they play all by the same book. This is something that is so important for all the companies.
Gianpiero?
It's important to create the right condition to establish in Europe a digital industry, because the digital environment is perceived since years as a set of tools or a set of different technologies, but not an industry that helps other industries to grow and to be better in their competition. This is ongoing now. Rules, digital single market, public procurement, and many other things will change the competition. The imbalance must be solved, but the mindset of the European investors, or European company, of European policymakers need to change, because if the mindset will be the same of the last 10 to 15 years, the problem will stay again.
And Oleg, thoughts?
I would say that the most important thing is to create a real digital single market, because we have examples of the legislation that was adopted by the last Commission when there is no full harmonization, and this creates difficulties for companies like ours, for retail business, e-commerce in particular. And a part of this, we need to assess what does it mean to be a dominant player in a small member state, because you might be relevant for a small member state, but if you look at the same company for the entire European Union or at a global scale, then you realize that that company is not relevant. So let's see how we can manage this, because otherwise we cannot grow European champions by screening that company through 28 sets of competition or consumer protection authorities.
Yeah. And Magda, when you're trying to educate the European regulators, what's the kind of the first thing you'd like them to think about?
Yeah, I think there's a big openness on the side of European decision makers, national decision makers, that they do want to listen to European companies. I think that's something, sometimes what is lost in the kind of mist of political debate at certain stage, right, is that you forget to assess on an ongoing basis on whether this change in the legislation will have impact on companies, what impact it will actually have, and what decision we eventually decide to make it, because it's always a matter of balancing. So I would say, being a lawyer, my belief is that law should create a framework for companies to operate, and should not be too often like a tool for political debate to answer some ad hoc situation or scandal, so to say. No, it should be rather, as we said, for something and not against something, in this case for the European companies and the European digital single market.
Well, I think a bunch of good ideas. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could have talked about this all afternoon, but I think it's a good start. I mean, it feels like, ecosystem, some proper harmonization, let's enforce the rules we have, let's not make any more rules that would, there's a starting point anyway, and with a new, set of MEPs coming in, it's a great opportunity to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but we are out of time, so I want to thank the panel for your thoughts, and thank you for staying till the afternoon to listen.